Thank you very much indeed for that warm Glasgow welcome. It's more than I got on Twitter on the way here. One in particular I'm going to refer to, a Mr. Callum McIntyre, whoever he is. Fuck off back to England, is what he said. Which inexplicably reminded me of a great story that my very dear friend Brian Dempsey told me about his brother, who was a school teacher in Coatbridge, very tough school. And they took the 5th year on an old rickety corporation bus through to Fife to the safari park there, Anstruther, I think it is. And of course, being a rickety corporation bus, do they still have corporation buses, by the way? I passed a bus today, McGill's bus. When did we go from corporation buses to McGill's buses? Are the buses any better? Under McGill's, are the bus drivers happier, public happier? I doubt it, but that's another story. Anyway, this rickety corporation bus from Coatbridge was halfway around the safari park and broke down. Of course, the kids got restless. The bad boys at the top of the bus pushed open the old emergency door at the back. 5 minutes later, they were smoking out the door, or the emergency door. 5 minutes after that, they'd pushed the emergency door right in and dropped down onto the tarmac. The park rangers arrived. That was the first problem. Rangers. The park rangers arrived, and the ranger got out of his car, apoplectic. He said, what are you doing down? What are you doing off the bus? What are you doing down here? What about the lions? And the lead boy, 5th year schoolboy, took a draw on his cigarette and said, we weren't going to touch your fucking lions. But I am going to touch your fucking lions, Mr. Salmond. You big pussycat, you. And I'm going back to Mr. Callum McIntyre for the first of the points that I wish to make. This is not going to all be about independence, as they call it, but it can be about other things too. There'll be a long Q&A session, so you don't actually need to interrupt me, but if you really have to, I don't mind. Stand up and shout if you want me to emphasize a point further or explain what I mean. But Callum McIntyre is important in this sense, because he speaks for a lot of people in this independence debate. Fuck off back to England. That's what they say in their hundreds, if not their thousands. The cyber gnats, as they're called. A swarm of bees that descend upon anyone. Never mind me, maybe I'm provocative. But even the most mild-mannered, querulous, undecided voter in this referendum is descended upon like a pack of hornets for daring to ask a question about what they mean by independence and whether it's a good thing. I don't understand, Mr. McIntyre, fuck off back to England. I'm as Scottish as he is. Or judging by the spelling of his name, he's as half Scottish as I am, if you get my drift. I've got the same right as anybody else in this room to have a point of view on this question. I mean, does being born in Scotland, educated in Scotland, growing up in Scotland, representing a Glasgow constituency in Parliament for 17 years, elected 4 times from the West End of Glasgow to Parliament, does that not entitle you to be Scottish? Does living outside of Scotland disqualify you from a point of view on whether the country should break up or not? How could that be? Sir Sean Connery has been frolicking with pushy galore in the Bahamas for almost all of my life, and he's never done speaking about Scottish independence. I don't know if he's got a vote either. It's been some time since he lived here, much longer ago than I did. But Callum McIntyre stands for or speaks for a lot of people in this independence debate. But as George W. Bush might put it, they misunderestimate me, because I'm not afraid, Mr. McIntyre, of you or anybody else. Neither you, you saltire-waving fanatic, or the other Egypts that are outside the front now waving their Union Jacks that don't want me to be here either. Maybe the police have cleared them away, I don't know. There's enough police on call for this. It's like an old firm game. I hope it's not going to turn into one. I'm not going to be intimidated out of having my say on this, and I'll tell you what my say is over the next 45 minutes or so, and then you can have your say and ask me any questions that you like on any subject. But first, before I leave Mr. McIntyre, I should point out that he is, judging by his previous tweets, a perfectly sane individual. Indeed, the vulgar, as he put it himself, order to me to go back to England was the only, you might say, distasteful tweet that I saw on his line. And one of the people on his line is my old friend Tommy Sheridan. Now, Tommy's like a little brother to me. Well, he was on that Big Brother as well, wasn't he? He's like a little brother to me. I've stood loyally by him through thick and thin. I've known him since he was a boy. But he tweeted yesterday, "I just don't understand George Galloway's position on Scottish independence." Well, Tommy, you can disagree with my position on independence vehemently, if you like. But it cannot be true that you don't understand it, because it's exactly the position that you used to have on the issue of Scottish independence. In fact, when I left Glasgow, not by choice, by the way, Tony Blair expelled me out of the Labour Party and then persuaded the Boundary Commission to abolish my constituency, just in case I escaped the first one. But when I left Glasgow in 2005, which is hardly ancient history, virtually everybody on the left had the same view as me, namely that what divides people in this world fundamentally is not the passport that they hold, it's not the place that they were born, but the class that they are. You see, it's kind of a cliche, but the Duke of Buccleuch has nothing in common with me. Nothing. Even though he was born on the same piece of rock as me. Now, maybe the Duke of Buccleuch is irrelevant in this, although he's Scottish. Well, Lord James Douglas Hamilton, is Lord James still in that Scottish Parliament? He sat with me in the Westminster Parliament for many, many years. You could not get more Scottish than Lord James Douglas Hamilton. He's really Scottish. He even wears tartan trousers at his dinner. I've been at dinner with him in his tartan trousers. He's probably got tartan pajamas, though I can't vouch for that. But I have nothing in common with Lord James Douglas Hamilton. Nothing at all. Nobody seems to know if he's still in the Scottish Parliament, so maybe he's now irrelevant also. Let's take Brian Souter, the owner not of McGill's buses, but of the world-spanning Stagecoach buses. He gave, sorry? I'm coming to that very point. I'm coming to that very point. Brian Souter gave Alex Salmond £1 million to persuade you to vote yes on independence. Who is Mr. Brian Souter? He's a Bible-thumping, bigoted, homophobic piece of trash, whether he's Scottish or whether he's not. He's a union-busting, Bible-thumping, bigoted, homophobic piece of trash. Why should I have anything in common with him just because he was born on the same piece of rock as me? I represent a constituency of poor, working people in the north of England. Bus drivers, cleansing department workers, hospital porters, council staff. They're all public sector workers because there ain't no private sector worth speaking of in Bradford West. Rather like some parts of Scotland. Don't you have more in common if you're a Paisley bus driver with a Bradford bus driver than you do with Brian Souter, Lord James Douglas Hamilton, or the Duke of Buccleuch? Don't you? That seems to me a self-evident truth. If you're a pensioner here in Glasgow, don't you have more in common with a pensioner in Bradford? Don't you have exactly the same money, exactly the same bills? Don't you watch the same television, speak the same language, eat the same food, enjoy the same sports, watch the same movies? Don't you watch X Factor at the same time as the pensioner in Bradford? You do. Do you think the Duke of Buccleuch's eating the same as you? Think he's living on the same money as you? This used to be ABC of Labourism when I was in the Labour Party. This used to be an ABC point that working people in this small island, a small country in a small world, working people who speak the same language, work for the same employers, join the same unions, have the same aspirations, that those working people's interests transcend a non-existent border across a small part of this small island. So don't tell me, Tommy, you don't understand it, because what I've just said is what you spent most of your life saying. The fact that you've now decided that actually we need a real border, that substituting the Union Jack for the saltire will begin a transformation for working people in Scotland. Well, it's you that's changed your mind, not me. I'm still saying what I have always said. Now, these are fundamental class points, and I don't make any apology for them. Just because the Labour Party doesn't speak like this anymore doesn't mean that I have changed my mind on these things. We have far more in common with working people in England than we will ever have with those who govern us today. I mean, somebody tweeted at me last week, Scotland's a socialist country. How so? How so? In what sense is it a socialist country? It votes in a left-of-centre way. But it isn't the government that decides. what your life is like. It's the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton once put it. So let's examine the economy. In what way is the economy of Scotland going to be transformed by running up a saltire at Edinburgh Castle rather than a Union Jack? The same people are going to have the same wealth, and the same people are going to have the same lack of wealth. Those that own banks, companies, factories, insofar as we've got many left, those that own steelworks, although we don't have any of them left, those that own petrochemical plants, we nearly didn't have any of them left. Those that own shipyards, according to BAE in the paper this morning, we might not have any of them left. These people who have the power to make economic decisions that decide how we live will be exactly the same people, whatever flag is flying from Edinburgh Castle. In fact, it's worse than that. Far from Scotland becoming a socialist country, if it was independent, it would be dragged on a race to the bottom by a perpetually Tory government in England. What do I mean? Well, if it were not for the huge percentage, 99% of the Scottish MPs at Westminster who are not Tories, do the maths. It will be virtually impossible to imagine anything other than a Tory government ruling England after the Union was broken. And incidentally, if it were not for the Scottish MPs at Westminster, we probably wouldn't be able to have this meeting this evening, because we'd be in the middle of yet another devastating war. If it wasn't for the Scottish MPs' votes 4 weeks ago in Parliament, we'd be at war with Syria and Iran and Russia and China now. Again, do the maths. Now, when I make that point, you could hardly credit this, but the cybernats answer, well, at least we wouldn't be in the war. No, you wouldn't be. That would be a big consolation to the people of Syria under bombardment. At least Scotland's not bombing us. If the country had already broken up, we'd already be at war with Syria and Iran, with Russia and China on the other side. Think. But if you have a perpetually Tory government in England, it's going to be a low tax, low public spending, extreme Thatcherite government. The perfect environment for capitalism. Do you think that a capitalist company is going to situate in Scotland, if it's a more socialist country, than it would in England, where the Tory government there had created pristine, perfect conditions, no regulation, low tax, low public expenditure? Of course, the companies would go there rather than here. That's what capitalists do. They go to the place where it's most convenient for them, where the unions are broken, where the tax is low. And if that's the case, what would we do then? Would we say, no, we're a socialist country. We're going to have free this, free that, high levels of public spending, high taxation, big corporation tax, profit tax. In which case, how many companies do you think would remain here? Why do you think a company would stay here to be taxed heavily if they could move to Newcastle and be taxed lightly? So we wouldn't say no. We'd say we'll have to do the same. So we'd cut the tax. We'd make the environment even more convenient for the Brian Souters of this world, than the English government had, who would then undercut us, and we'd then undercut them, and they'd then undercut us, and before you know it, none of the things that are valuable to you and me that have been achieved in Scotland by social democracy over 100 years will continue to exist. It's not rocket science. It's really obvious. Those, like Tommy, who imagined that an independent Scotland would be a cold water Cuba, are living in cloud cuckoo land. Even if everybody in Scotland voted for it to be, and they wouldn't, not even all of you would vote for it to be a cold water Cuba. And you've paid money to come and see me. Why, even if everybody voted for it, you cannot make a socialist country just because you want it. You've got to have the economic and financial wherewithal in order to do it. And you need a critical mass of people to stand up against the vicissitudes of the world capitalist economic system. Do you really think Scotland's up for that? Up for being Albania? Up for being Cuba? Blockaded, embargoed, embattled, besieged? Of course it isn't. Of course it isn't. Not even everybody in this room would be. So, once we had this race to the bottom, and the people discovered that this independence wasn't all that it cracked up to be, what happens then? You can't go back. You can't say that was a mistake. Can we put things back together again? You're stuck with a separate country. And what do the people do when they discover that there's nothing extra in their pocket? In fact, some of the things they enjoyed before no longer exist. I'll tell you what could happen. Well, I'll tell you what would definitely happen. The Callum McIntyres who tell me to fuck off back to England, their language would get worse. And it wouldn't be just fuck off back to England, it would be those fuckers in England. Trust me on that. And a road to a politics of grudge and resentment and even hatred would have been embarked upon. But it wouldn't just be the English. There's other minorities, some of them visible, some of them not. Although they're visible on a Sunday, or they're visible as they take their children to certain schools. And they would be amongst the scapegoats. Trust me on that. I'm 59 years old. I know Scotland very, very well. I talked about Coatbridge earlier. When I went to work for Helen Liddell, nee Riley, when John Smith, God rest his soul, died, when she stood in his stead in the by-election, there was people shouting at me in Airdrie, go back to where you came from. And they didn't mean England. At first I thought they meant Russia, because when I was young, that's the kind of thing some people used to say, but they didn't. They meant Ireland. They meant the famine is over. Why don't you go home? That's what they meant. And there's quite a few people like that in Scotland. I saw them in a frenzy at Ibrox Park last month. You didn't see it because the Scottish media ignored it. If you saw it on YouTube. You didn't see it on the BBC. You didn't see it on STV. You didn't read it in the Herald or the Scotsman. Least of all, you didn't read it in the Daily Record. A frenzy of uniformed soldiers singing sectarian songs in uniform, waving sectarian flags and banners. And not one Scottish media outlet reported it until The Guardian in England reported it. And the Scotsman followed suit 3 days after the event. Why didn't the Scottish media report it? Because they're scared of these people. Why didn't a single, I mean a single, let me qualify that. None of the mainstream Scottish political parties or any representative of the mainstream Scottish political parties has yet, even now, raised a single question about that event. Only I put down motions and questions in the British Parliament about it and caused an inquiry to be made, which predictably discovered there was no case to answer, even though thousands of people were present at the crime. Why didn't a single mainstream Scottish politician raise this? Because they're scared of these people. Which people? Is that what you mean? The people who were in the frenzy, the bigots, the people who sing that the famine's over. Why don't people like me go home, even though my family came here 100 years ago? I mean, how long do you have to be here before this is home? There were... no, they would agree with me. That's how they're threatening. Look, listen, brother. I'm here tonight with a lot of policemen because they threatened to slash me, murder me, rape my wife. So don't tell me that they agree with me. Don't tell me that they agree with me. No, 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 no. They do agree with staying with the Union. That's true. But if Scotland becomes independent, these people are going to be a percentage. Let me finish. These people are going to be a percentage of 5 million people instead of a percentage of 65 million people. 12 times more of a proportion than they currently are. 12 times more. And by the way, in a country where the media and the political class are scared of them. If you're not afraid of that, you should be. Well, you should be. Well, you should be. Well, you should be afraid of the fact. You should be all right, you should be afraid of the fact that not one Scottish politician, not one, other than, God bless him, Patrick Harvey of the Green Party, not one Scottish mainstream politician has, between that day and this day, even raised a question about the fact that British uniformed soldiers were in a sectarian frenzy at Ibrox Park last month. If you're not scared of that, I don't know why you're not scared of that. You should be. You should be afraid of the fact. You should be afraid of the fact. All right, now you're heckling, right? You can come in at question time. Now you're heckling. You should be afraid of the fact that it took the English Guardian to report this story before a single Scottish newspaper, and that was the Scotsman, which is hardly read by anyone, which reported it. The Daily Record still hasn't reported it. According to the Daily Record, it never happened because they're scared to offend the people who are turned on by that kind of thing. Now, if you're a Catholic of Irish extraction, like me, be afraid of that when these people are 12 times more numerically significant than they currently are in the British state. I'm going to do, well, let me turn to that very point. Until they sacked me because of Rangers protests. You're making my point. You're making my point. Now, I'm going to turn to this very point. Because amongst the most asinine things that are ever uttered in this debate are uttered every day towards me on Twitter. How come you're in favor of independence for Palestine but not independence for Scotland? Is it fair enough? Well, you're stupid if you think it's fair enough. You're stupid if you think it's fair enough. Because, well, let me tell you how stupid you're being. Because you can vote for independence anytime you like. The Palestinians have never had a vote, will never get a vote, will never be allowed to choose to be independent. Moreover, there are no tanks. There are no tanks in the streets of Scotland stopping you from being independent. There's a tank on every street in Palestine ready to gun down anybody who says they want independence in Palestine. Israel has occupied Palestine and wiped it from the map. Oh dear. We've even got a Zionist present, my goodness. All human life is here, as they used to say in the News of the World. Well, look, that's usually twinned with, how come you support the reunification of Ireland, but you don't support the separation of Scotland? Well, apart from the fact the clue is in the word reunification, apart from that, Ireland was invaded and occupied against the will of the Irish people and held for 700 years, and a part of it still is, against the will of the Irish people. The Scots can vote for independence anytime they like, and they will have it. The Irish did vote for independence and had to fight a war in order to bring it about, and still 1/4 of their country remains under British occupation by force. Can't you see a difference there? Scotland is not a colony of England. Scotland and England together colonized the world. The whole world was colonized by us. There is nobody forcing you to remain in Britain. Listen, there is nobody forcing you to remain in Britain. Since universal suffrage, since women got the vote in 1928, we could have voted any time we liked for independence, and we would have had it. Somebody tweeted me today, every small nation has the right of self-determination, but you have the right of self-determination. And you're going to exercise it again next September. Self-determination means the right to choose whether to be an independent state or whether to be a part of a multinational state. You have that right. You've had it for nearly 100 years. So nobody is occupying Scotland. There are no tanks, no military force. Nobody's being tortured in a dungeon like the Palestinians are. Nobody is being refused the right to decide on their future. So I regard the comparison between Scotland's situation and the situation of the Palestinian people to be a really big insult, both to the Palestinian people and to the people of the state that we currently are in. Now, am I a British unionist? Am I really a British unionist? Do you know anything about me? Don't you know that my flag is red? That the people waving the Union Jacks outside hate me more than they hate almost anybody? I mean, if you were to draw up a poll of these people, of who they hate, don't you think I'd be near the top of it? I hate British nationalism just as much as I hate Scottish nationalism. And in fact, the two are a mirror image of each other. Yes, they are, because Nigel Farage thinks that standing at the Channel ports with a red face, waving a Union Jack, shouting boo at Johnny Foreigner is going to solve our problems. And the Scottish nationalists think the same, that standing on a now non-existent border, shouting boo at the English is going to solve our problems. Well, it is not in either case. It is not. I'm not a British unionist. I have all my life fought against British imperialism, more than you or anybody else in this room. I have fought British imperialism. It's because I don't want to break the unity of the British working people, the working class. Because, not just because that would be a pity for both people, not just because it would lead to a reduction in the standard of life of both people, but because it would mean that we lost any chance of ever having the critical mass of population and consciousness to challenge that which really oppresses us, which is not the English, but which is the capitalist economic system and the imperialist foreign policy that goes with it. That's what I believe in. Now, I'm not with this bitter together mob. That's why I'm here on my own, Daniel, in the lion's den. Because I'm not going to stand under a Union Jack. I'm not going to sit next to a Tory. I hate Tories. With every beat of my heart, I curse and hate Tories. I'm not going to campaign on any platform with them. I'm not one of them that say Scotland couldn't be independent. Of course it could. I'm not going to say that Scotland would become Burundi or Bangladesh if it became independent. Of course it wouldn't. I'm not saying you couldn't be independent. I'm saying you shouldn't be independent, that it is a bad idea. That's all I'm here to argue, and would be a bad idea for all the reasons which I shall adumbrate now and in the Q&A session. But Scottish people are quite good at counting the pennies. I mean, we're not foolish people when it comes to money. I'm going to Aberdeen later this month. I'm hoping that I sell enough tickets that there'll be more people in the audience than there is on the stage. It's quite hard to part a Scotsman from his money, and rightly so. Money's hard to come by. And you have to really contemplate whether this decision is going to leave you worse off than you are now, in both the short and the long term. And I believe that it is. Because I know, as a 4 times elected Glasgow MP, how much leverage we've got with the public purse precisely to avoid independence. Let me tell you a story. The late Alan Clark, the famous diarist, was the defence minister when I was the MP for Yarrows in Scotstoun. The Royal Navy was going to order 5 Type 23 frigates. Now, don't get me wrong. I can't think of a worse use of public expenditure than Royal Navy Type 23 frigates. I hated every minute of the time that I spent, and I spent a lot of time lobbying Alan Clark that all 5 of those boats should be built at Yarrows. And I won. Me, the late Donald Dewar, was the MP at the time for Garscadden, Ian Davidson, who's still the MP for the other side of the water, and others. We were never done lobbying Alan Clark. And one of the arguments we made is you've got to give us this work. Because if Yarrows closes, it'll really boost the SNP. It'll really boost the chances of the country breaking up. And guess what? He bought it, and he placed all 5 of those orders with Yarrows. Hallelujah. At least our people got work out of it. If these Type 23 frigates were going to have to be built somewhere, better that they were built on the Clyde than anywhere else. That was my duty, and I did it. Now, that is replicated throughout the Scottish economy. The reason why you've got free prescriptions free care for the elderly, and no tuition fees, whilst my constituents pay for their prescriptions, pay for their care, and pay for their university, is precisely because of the Barnett formula, negotiated at that time primarily by Labour politicians in Scotland, which said you must give Scotland a bigger share of public expenditure per head. Of course, we made the arguments. The size of the country, the historic pattern of industrial development and de-industrialization and so on. But at bottom we were saying to the English Treasury, you better give us a good settlement, or it can only fan the flames of separatism in the country. I've done all that. I've been there. I've got the T-shirt on all of these things. Joel Barnett used to sit in the same tea room as me, still does. He's a lord now. I'm still lobbying him on this very point, even though he retired after his formula 30 or 35 years ago. He told me the last time I spoke to him, there's no point in arguing this with me. I've got nothing to do with it anymore. So, when that's no longer there, when there's no Royal Navy, unless you're going to set up a Scottish Royal Navy, are you? I mean, you're keeping the Queen, why not a Scottish Royal Navy? How much is that going to cost? Huh? Scotland has thousands of miles of coastline. Did you know that? How big a navy you're going to have? How are you going to pay for it? How many frigates are you going to need? When you set up, well, I'm coming to Trident, don't you worry about that. When you set up a Scottish state, you're going to need a Scottish embassy everywhere in the world. Imagine, a lot of you will need to be ambassadors. But every ambassador needs a staff, diplomats, administrative. Every embassy needs a big building and a residence and a big motor car and security. How many of these embassies are you going to have? Where are you going to find the ambassadors, and how are you going to pay for it? Have people thought about these things? Or do they imagine that the English embassy is going to do it for you? Because I'm here to tell you that will not happen. Well, if public expenditure per head of the population falls, if there are no MOD orders, if the costs of your own army, navy, air force are taken into account, and it can't be that you're not going to have these things, because Alex Salmond's already told us we're going to be so independent. Our head of state is going to be a German queen. We're keeping the English pound, governed by the Bank of England, the clue is in the name, with a Canadian governor, Mark Carney. We're going to remain in NATO, an American-led military alliance. What's the point of waving a CND flag and twittering on about Trident if you're still in NATO and the American government can order you into action anytime that it likes? You're not going to have Trident. You're not going to have Trident. But trust me, it's going to have to go somewhere, although it may take some years before it gets there. Remember, you heard it here. It's a NATO base, you know. You're going to tell the American president it's got to be out a week next Tuesday, because he's here to tell you it ain't. Trident will still be here years after independence were it to happen. But in any case, if Trident moved from the Clyde to the Tyne, how does that make you any safer? How does that make you any safer? If a nuclear weapon is fired from the Tyne, the person at whom it is fired will return with a nuclear bomb. And if it hits the Tyne, trust me, the Clyde no longer exists. Because nuclear weapons don't recognize borders, however firmly you etch them onto the map. They keep saying how much they hate Britain. It's funny, they want to keep so much of it. They want to keep its queen. They want to keep its pound. They want to keep our fiscal and monetary policy determined at the Treasury in London. They want to stay in the same military alliance. They want to stay in the European Union, although, by the way, the Spanish government and other governments will have something to say about that. So don't take it for granted that you'll be in the European Union at all. But if you are, how independent is all that? How independent is it to have the British Queen, the British pound, in the EU, in NATO? How independent is that? It's a nonsense. It's an illusion. It really is just substituting one flag for another flag and leaving the same rich and powerful people in charge of your life and your affairs. So, I've spoken almost for long enough. I've made Mr. Callum McIntyre famous or infamous, depending on your point of view. I just conclude this part of the proceedings by saying this. Of course, you're entitled to say yes, as I'm entitled to say no. You're lucky. You've got a vote. I do not, but I've got a voice, and I intend to keep using it. Not because I hate Scotland, but because I don't hate it. I can't tell you the joy unconfined I feel being back here in Glasgow, which I never wanted to leave. As I crossed the border, the blue sky and the sun shining on the southern uplands, saw my name up there on the sign, Galloway, Dumfries and Galloway, showing my wife my ancestral home. I don't think she believed me. I love Scotland just as much as Alex Salmond does, or Mr. McIntyre does. And it's because I love it, I'm here to tell you, just say no. Thanks very much.